So we have the pleasure to welcome Marcus and Jade. So they both work at the Center for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence at the Future of Humanity Institute. The Center for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence works on helping humanity capture the benefits of artificial intelligence while mitigating the risks associated to it. So it researches neglected problems related to the political aspects of developing advanced AI systems, and also engages with policymakers. But they will tell you much more about it. And first, we're going to welcome Marcus. So Marcus is the head of policy and operations at the Center for the Governance of AI. And he will give us an overview of what they are doing there, as well as different challenges in governing AI. Thanks, and Yiflin, please come here.
Great. Thank you all so much. Really nice to see you all here. I have a background in doing effective altruism sort of community building in Sweden. And so coming to a new city and just seeing this an entire other community of people who are excited about these kinds of ideas is super nice. It's super exciting to me. Cool. So what I'm going to plan on doing is to give you guys basically an overview of the Center for the Governance of AI, what we're doing, and sort of why we're doing it, and hopefully give you some kind of sense of what does doing research in this space of AI governance actually mean. I'll also try and explain to you also what AI governance actually kind of means. So hopefully that'll be exciting. You guys can just interrupt me whenever you want if something I say seems super unclear or weird in some kind of way. Sounds good? Nice. Cool. So first, I'll start by giving a super brief background. Caroline did this a bit of why might you think that working on shaping the development of sort of artificial intelligence, in particular maybe advanced artificial intelligence, might be a good thing to do to make the world a better place. And then after doing that, I'll sort of explain what AI governance is, how that fits into this question of how we shape this technology in the right way, and then also give you an overview of our work. To start with this first question, I'll just show you guys this sort of graph from one of our sort of earlier research projects where we basically went and we asked experts in the field of artificial intelligence. So we went to the top conferences of people working in machine learning. And we asked them questions such as, when do you think that artificial intelligence systems will exceed human performance? So we asked them specifically about something we called high-level machine intelligence, where that was defined as when unaided machines can accomplish every task better and more cheaply than human workers. So we asked them to give basically timelines. When do they think that this is going to happen? And you have the results plotted on this graph. And there's a bunch of things you can take from this. One thing you can take from it is you might see these gray little lines. Do you see those? There's a bunch of small gray little lines. That's us taking an individual respondent's results and plotting them on the graph. And the fun thing you can see there is there's a huge discrepancy in what people are saying. And then the red here, we have the median outcome, the median sort of researcher's view. And there's some interesting things here. One thing is that big uncertainty, and the other thing is just that you have some pretty high likelihoods of something that would be very transformative to the world happening within the next few decades. So median result, roughly you have a 50% chance, according to these machine learning experts, of reaching high-level machine intelligence, where that's basically machines or artificial intelligence systems sort of beating humans at nearly all tasks within the next 50 years. If that's the case, a bunch of things are going to change. The world is going to look very different, and we are most likely not prepared to deal with that, and so therefore we should be doing something to figure that out. Getting a bit more specific, here are some general ideas of sort of why you might think that you might want to shape the development of this technology in sort of the right direction. There's a number of different arguments. I'll maybe ask you guys to give a lot of people who'd be interested in sort of the effective altruism movement will be familiar with these arguments at the bottom. Who here knows about the AI alignment problem? Okay, so roughly half. Okay, so that's roughly the problem of, say you have a system, and that system you can sort of, it's super capable, it's much more capable than a human, and you're going to try to figure out, what do I tell the system to do? And the rough idea of this problem is that it turns out it's super difficult to figure out what to tell it to do. A lot of times you'll end up saying something, and it'll do something that you actually don't want it to do. It's kind of like a King Midas type problem. So you like wish for a thing and it does the thing in a way that you don't want it to do the thing. But there's a number of other sort of potentially more sort of likely, but maybe like less high impact ways in which you might think that caring about this problem makes a lot of sense. Some are issues that are like often like discussed in newspapers, etc., that like are happening today, where we have these systems, they're starting to play a bigger and bigger role in society, and so we're seeing them sort of problems crop up today, such as sort of problems in terms of privacy, in terms of these algorithms being used in systems and not being transparent to people what they're actually doing, these kinds of things. Other sort of arguments, I think like the argument that I will most often think of is sort of the argument I started with. Something along the lines of, it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be some like systems that are going to change the world in all kinds of ways. And so if you want to like change the world, if you want to make the world a better place, one good place to start is to start with sort of the technology or sort of the trend that will be shaping the world and make sure that that trend goes in the right direction. And that's kind of one just like general overarching argument you can have. You can also look at some very more sort of specific issues. So you can look at, if you have this technology, it's going to be developing, it's going to be sort of become more and more powerful. In that case, you might think that sort of geopolitics and national security will be like entirely changed. And we need to figure out how will it be changed and what can we do about it. You might also think sort of even more specifically that nuclear security is like an example of something that might change quite a bit. So if you have more advanced systems, you might end up being able to do things like, one problem is that you might end up in cases where you can undermine another country's second strike capability, i.e. like I can use systems to figure out where are there like nuclear weapons, and then I can like disable them, and that becomes a problem because then my enemy doesn't think that they can sort of, they can retaliate if I sort of am the first to strike. And this is a problem for sort of nuclear stability. And then there's a number of other sort of like medium-term issues that you might be concerned with. Another example of those is often under the term of, sort of future of work. So like what happens when these systems become capable of carrying out a bunch of tasks that currently employ humans? How will that shape society? What can we do to make sure that that transition goes as well as possible? So that's some sort of overall arguments of sort of why you might think that working to shape the sort of development of this technology seems like a good idea. Cool. So maybe I've convinced you that you want to shape this technology in the right direction. And if so, maybe I've convinced you that you should be thinking about AI governance. AI governance, in general, is about sort of looking at the context and the institutions that shapes the incentives and behaviors of developers and users of AI. So the idea is sort of this technology, it's going to be used, it's going to be developed in a context. And that context is going to be shaping what actors do. It's going to be shaping how these actors develop the technology and how they use the technology. And so if you want to shape how they do so, then you want to be shaping sort of the governance structures. That's kind of the general idea. When I say like governance here, oftentimes people will think in terms of like governments, or they'll think in terms of regulation. We use this word in a much broader sense. So what we mean basically is all of the things that are involved in sort of shaping the behaviors of the actors in the space. So we're also thinking about things like sort of you can use the reputation of a company to sort of make sure that they act in a nice way rather than just like regulation, for example. You can also think about financial flows, about talent flows, etc. A bunch of different other mechanisms you can look at. Another way in which sort of this like government governance sort of conflation is confusing is that we're also looking at a number of other actors. Plausibly, it's the case that there are other actors in this space that will be maybe as important or like nearly as important to sort of work with as governments, the foremost of which might be sort of the people or the labs or the places where you're actually developing this technology. And then there's sort of this other aspect to what we mean by AI governance, which is this sort of normative aspect. So the reason that we're actually like doing this research, the reason that we care about this problem is because we want to make the world a better place. So we're not just asking like how are the actors' behaviors shaped by their context. we're asking that question because we want to figure out how can we shape that context such that we can make the world a better place. So there's this like normative aspect that is sort of at the forefront of our minds of like the reason that we're actually doing the research. And then sort of I'll give you like guys another sort of simple case for why you might want to put energy into AI governance, beyond sort of just working on sort of AI as in general as being a particular problem. Firstly, we have this like first premise that shaping the development of this technology is important. Secondly, the sort of capabilities of this technology is growing quite rapidly at the moment. There's a number of different examples of this. And then the third thing is that sort of we're starting to build up these AI governance structures at the moment. There's a bunch of attention in this field from a number of different sources, in particular from maybe like governments, from companies, etc., trying to figure out how can we govern this technology in the right direction. Some examples are a bunch of countries now are sort of publishing national strategies for how they're gonna sort of work with this technology, how they're gonna sort of make sure that they, usually what they say is something along the lines of like, we're gonna make sure that we're the leaders in this field. Everyone wants to be leaders in this field because it seems like it's gonna be a good way to sort of build up your national economy, etc. So these are being developed. At the same time, some people are doing some work to figure out if we can have sort of global governance systems of this technology. One of the examples of this is the Ipcc for AI, or IPAI. Macron has been a part of this, of trying to set up a sort of an equivalence of the Ipcc, but for artificial intelligence. So like an expert panel, basically, trying to figure out how is this technology gonna change going forward, and what can we do as an international community to make sure that the technology is sort of used responsibly, etc.
Could you clarify what is IPCC?
Ipcc. Oh, so the Ipcc is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they're the sort of the body of a lot of researchers, a tremendous amount of researchers, who sort of collate all the data on climate change and sort of where we're at in terms of like how much we're going to be warming, etc. So that's like the foundation of basically everything that happens in sort of working on climate change. And the last thing is that like labs and sort of the companies, etc., that are actually developing this technology are also starting to think about these governance issues. So it seems like there's a bunch of things happening. There's like governance structures are being created, etc. But the thing that's sort of lagging behind is just like people thinking about these issues carefully and trying to understand how do we actually want this technology to be governed, and what structures do we actually want. And that's sort of one of the main impetuses that sort of makes me really excited about working in this area, because there's just like an amazing amount of need for people to think carefully about these issues. Because if we don't, most likely we're going to be ending up with some kind of governance structures. And if we don't think about it, then we're likely to end up with structures that aren't going to be sort of conducive to the goals that we're excited about. Cool. Last thing I'll say about sort of us as like an organization, I'll show you. I don't know if I've showed this to you, Jade. This is like my model of how we as an organization make a difference. It's a very simple model. We do two things. In the end, we want to get to the good stuff. We want to make the world a better place. And the way we do this is, firstly, we try and find out things about how the world works. So we want to find out how is sort of this technology going to be developing. We want to find out sort of what actions would be conducive to making the world a better place, so to sort of govern this technology in the right way. And then beyond that, we want to be figuring out how do we actually make actors act based on this knowledge. With some kind of assumption that like oftentimes knowledge will be like conducive to taking good actions and making the world better and not sort of making mistakes, etc. And then once we do that, we end up with making it the case that actors sort of take the correct actions, and therefore we end up with hopefully AI being governed sort of better, basically. Most of our time will be spent on this thing, but we also spend some time of sort of making sure that our knowledge also actually influences decision makers. Cool. Given this, I'll give you guys like a brief overview of sort of some of the work that we might do in this field. Most of the work will be sort of put into the framework of this agenda that we have. If you're interested in this sort of field, this is sort of my main tip of like a good start, a good place to sort of look if you want to find out more about what sort of the research field of AI governance is actually about. So this was written by our director, Alan Defoe. You see his face there on the left. And it's roughly divided into 4 sections. So the first section is this technical landscape section, which is basically about figuring out how is this technology going to be developing going forward. Like how are the technical sort of capabilities of this technology going to be changing over the coming decades. Secondly, we're interested in sort of what would be like under the category of politics. I kind of think about this in terms of like, so yes, we're going to have these technical capabilities, but how will these technical capabilities sort of impact the world? And so there you might ask questions about sort of like, given that technologies are going to be developing in this and that way, how is that going to affect sort of democracy? How is that going to be changing sort of the viability of authoritarian regimes or these kinds of questions? Third one, we come to the question of ideal governance, which is kind of the question of how do we, like, what kinds of sort of governance systems would we ideally like to see? What are we kind of aiming for in doing this kind of research? And then the last thing, policy, is basically figuring out, okay, so this is where we want to go. This is how we think the technology is going to be developing going forward. Here's some of the impacts that we think it's going to have. Given all of this, what do we do? What do we want actors in this space to be doing to make sure that that this technology is developed in the right direction? That's kind of the framework that we often use when we think about the kind of research that we want to do in this space. And I'll jump into each of these and give you like a brief little example of the kind of research that we might do. So starting with the technical landscape, I'll just briefly talk about, how am I doing on time? Good. Okay. Nice. So the sort of one thing you might think of here is sort of mapping, thinking about sort of how is this technology going to be developing going forward. One example here of someone who's involved with us, Nick Bostrom, one of the directors of the center, wrote this book, Superintelligence, that started a lot of the thinking about sort of AI safety in this kind of space. Sort of less sort of long-term type thinking might come from examples such as this report, Deciphering China's AI Dream, by one of our researchers, Jeff Ding, which basically looks at the question of sort of how is artificial intelligence as a technology being developed in China, and what is sort of the Chinese government's sort of industrial policy related to artificial intelligence. And how are they likely to be acting in this space? What are the investments they're making? And also looking at questions such as how is China sort of China's AI industry doing compared to other countries' AI industries, for example? That seems like a very important question if you're interested in sort of how this technology is going to be shaped going forward. For example, if I want to be like shaping the incentives of actors to make sure that they sort of act in sort of socially responsible ways, one really important question is going to be like, where are they? Are they going to be in China? Are they going to be in the US, for example? This one I already showed you a little bit, but this is the kind of work that we'll continue doing going forward, doing things like surveying experts about their views. I think going forward we'll probably also think more about how what experts, sort of machine learning experts' views are of sort of governance issues in this space as well. I think is sort of the next step going on here, as opposed to just asking these questions about sort of what their views are in terms of like how quickly this technology will be developing. I'll skip over that. Going to politics and security, one example here is looking at quite a bit of our work will be sort of using historical analogies to try and think about these issues. It's going to be, in general, thinking about these issues is quite difficult. We don't have a lot of particularly good evidence, but one potential source of evidence is to try and find analogies. So you look at sort of historical analogies of what are other cases in which we've had transformative technologies that will have some kind of analogy to artificial intelligence. And how did we as a global society deal with these kinds of technologies, and what are lessons we can learn there? So one example that we're looking at here is this example on the right, is how we as a global society after the Second World War dealt with nuclear weapons. So specifically, this is an image from the Baruch Plan when this was debated in the newly formed UN of trying to figure out basically like, could we broker a deal to do with nuclear weapons, and sort of the Baruch Plan was sort of after a long line of different parts of both the US and the USSR, trying to come up with what could be deals we could make where we could make sure that this technology was kind of contained. None of these plans really panned out, and there's probably some lessons there for us to learn about what are sort of the likelihoods that we can sort of come to international agreements about transformative technologies. In this case, technologies that would be very transformative in sort of the military sense. Whereas AI is interesting because it has sort of very much more than sort of nuclear had, a dual use nature where it's both really, really useful for sort of economic purposes, but it's also going to be very useful for potentially for sort of military purposes, for example. Another line of work we call levers of influence. This is thinking about how will sort of, what are the ways in which sort of the most important actors in this space can influence each other. And in particular, the sort of where we've started this work is to think about how are, what are the ways in which the US government can interact with AI companies. Say the US government starts believing that sort of this technology is very, very important. They're going to be excited about sort of using this technology and in some way sort of exert influence over how this technology is developed. In that case, one really, really important question becomes, what are the ways in which they can interact with these companies? What are the things that they can do? What are sort of their legal tools that they can use to exert influence over these companies? Another example of a report that we've written was written last year, which is called the Malicious Use of Artificial Intelligence, that basically looks at this question. One of the sort of the risks, one like class of risks that people think about when they think about sort of potential risks from artificial intelligence are misuse risks. So these are risks where someone sort of finds this technology useful and they find them useful for sort of malicious uses. They find them useful for sort of bad things bad actors want to do with them. And so basically what this report did, it brought together a bunch of experts in this field from sort of everything from sort of the artificial intelligence labs to academics to people working in international security, etc. And basically just produced a framework of what are the risks that we have in this space and what can we do to sort of alleviate them. Yeah, I should probably say something on the ideal governance. So I'll stop at this one. Another set of work that we're also doing that's sort of similar to the expert survey work is looking at what the public believes about artificial intelligence. And so you might think that if you want to figure out what you want to, how you want this technology to be developing going forward, one important question becomes, what does the public actually believe is important in terms of developing this technology? So this is some results from a public opinion poll that we did on the US public, looking at these kinds of questions early this year, where we asked a number of different questions. For example, these kinds of questions of like, how quickly do they believe that this technology will develop? It turns out that they believe it's going to be developing a lot quicker than the experts believe. If I remember this correctly, I think the median prediction, so like the sort of the 50th percentile person, believed that there was a 50% chance that artificial intelligence would reach like human level intelligence in 2028. So in not a lot of time. Other questions that we asked were questions like this one, where we tried to figure out what are the kinds of issues that the US public believes are sort of the most important governance issues in the AI governance space. And sort of you have a bunch of little plots here, and sort of the main conclusion I take from this, you have a bunch of things like digital manipulation, you have like surveillance, cyber attacks, autonomous weapons, etc. The main conclusion that I drew from this was that to a lot of people, it seems like all of these questions are very, very similar in terms of their importance. So on the sort of axis here, we have the probability that they think that it's going to sort of affect a large number of people. And here we have what they think the impact is. And so it might look like there's a bit of a spread here, but actually the graph is like truncated. And so for most of the things, what people say is, oh, okay, well, it's like 60 to 70% chance that it's going to happen. And it seems really important. And so that's, I think, is sort of a start to work of trying to sort of tease out what are the issues that sort of the US public or publics around the world actually believe are important. And we're going to be continuing this work, looking, for example, what the EU public believes, and also looking at things like what the Chinese public believes to do with these technologies. Lastly, looking at policy, we're looking at this question of sort of what can we do today to shape this technology in the right direction. We have 2 projects going on here. One is a project led by Jade, focusing on things like, we have a bunch of names for this project. One of them is AI for social responsibility, where we're looking at basically how do we make sure that we can figure out what actors, sort of what companies, for example, are sort of acting responsibly in this space, are acting in such a way that this technology can be used for sort of the human common good. So we're trying to figure out, first, how can we figure out who's sort of the good guys or something like this? And secondly, trying to figure out how can we sort of incentivize them to act in the right way. So taking sort of the broad perspective of how do we solve this sort of common goods problem that we have going on. Another sort of more specific example is working on something called the Windfall Clause, where we're trying to figure out how can we. So one sort of issue that people sometimes talk about to do with artificial intelligence are sort of worries that it will mean that sort of capital or sort of power will accrue to a small number of actors. And so one potential issue or one potential sort of solution you might have there is something called the Windfall Clause, which is basically if I, as a company, happen to sort of win the lottery, or I happen to just kind of like win the race, I, as a company, end up sort of taking very, very large sort of market share of sort of the world's GDP or something like this. Then you might think that I should give away sort of like a proportion of my profits to sort of humanity as a whole. And so the Windfall Clause is basically something like this. So you put some kind of cap on your profits, for example, or if you just like happen to have a certain ridiculous sort of like way too large proportion of the world's GDP, then you can use that, you can take some of that money and sort of give it back to the world as a whole. That's the idea behind the Windfall Clause, and we're now sort of working on actually sort of operationalizing this. So asking questions such as, is it actually legal for a company to sign something like a Windfall Clause? Can I, as a CEO, do that? It looks like you can, specifically in Delaware, where most of these companies will have their headquarters. And then thinking about how can we actually sort of make sure that something like this is realized in the world. Yeah, those were my things. Great. We'll hopefully hear some questions later.
Thank you. Great, thank you so much. And now we're going to welcome Jade Long, who is the head of partnerships at the Center for the Governance of AI, as well as a researcher, and she's going to dive in a particular aspect of her research. Don't forget that you can ask questions on Slido, and the password is Paris in small letters. So it's very easy, so don't hesitate. All right, let's welcome Jade.
All right. Really cool to see you all here. What I'm going to spend the next, it's going to be over 20 minutes, and I'm going to ignore Laura's hand signals. I'm going to dive into a piece of research which gives you an example of the kind of things that we do at the Center for the Governance of AI. And the piece of research that I'm going to dive into specifically asks the question of how do you understand the incentives of the powerful actors that are pursuing the development of artificial intelligence today. Cool. Imagine you've built AGI. Not you, we have built AGI. So you wake up tomorrow morning, you hop on Twitter, and someone's like, oh no, we've built AGI. Who do you want to have built AGI? You've got 4 options. A, Alphabet. B, the US government. C, Baidu, which is a Chinese firm that's more or less leading in AGI development in China. And D, the Chinese government. This is who you think you want to be in control of the technology, not who you think is most likely to get there. And you can't not put your hand up. And you can't say, I wish AGI didn't happen. Close your eyes, and I'll read out the options. All right. Who wants it to be A, Alphabet? B, the US government. Ooh, interesting. C, Baidu. And D, the Chinese government. Nice. All right, you can open your eyes. Most of you wanted Alphabet, apparently, and there was one cheeky person who wanted the US government, and everyone stayed away from C and D, and I will not comment on why. That might be the case. The question here isn't that there is a right answer to this. The question here is that this is the kind of question that we want to know the answers to when we're thinking about the likelihood of AI governance going well in the future. And the reason why questions like this are important are because this is, as Marcus said, a really transformative technology. And there are a number of really powerful actors, these 4 actors included, who have explicitly put a lot of resource and intention into pursuing the development of artificial intelligence today. So the proposition that I'm going to run you through, broadly speaking, is something like this: that AI governance can be framed as a set of strategic interactions between some of these actors who each have a stake in the development and deployment of artificial intelligence. When I say strategic interactions, that's something like them interacting with each other to try to figure out who is going to give them what they want and who is going to constrain what they can do. And when I say actors, here I mean not actors like actors, I mean actors like governments, actors like firms, actors like labs, actors like research communities. Basically anyone who has an investment in developing and deploying this kind of technology for whatever reason they might want to do it for. Now, there's a lot of different ways of answering this question. And so the kind of research that I'm going to take you through in this presentation takes a particular view that this kind of research can be answered by looking specifically at the actors themselves, as opposed to their environment, as opposed to a bunch of other ththings. And I've got 3 reasons why I think that's a good idea. And I'll take you through those really quickly before we actually go into what I actually mean by analyzing these actors in the first place. So the first reason why we want to focus on actors kind of centers on this question of why do we stand here and assume that artificial intelligence isn't going to go well for us by default? Normally, when you answer that question, there are kind of 2 buckets of answers that you get. One is that technically it's a really hard problem. So even if we tried, and even if we were well-intentioned, there is a very powerful nature to this technology. As Marcus mentioned, the AI alignment problem is one version of this problem, which means that it's hard to guarantee that this system is going to go in the direction that you want it to go. That's kind of one category of answer that you get. The second category of answer that you get, which is what we're going to focus on today and what we focus on at the center, is the kind of answer where it's more about the problematic actors. So even if you could assure that you could design the system really well, you still have a bunch of actors who are probably going to prioritize pursuing capabilities of these systems over safety, because there is a strong incentive to do so, because they want these systems to be powerful so they can gain whatever they want to gain from it. So if you have some set of actors that are going to do that, and B, some of these actors you have to assume are sort of competent. So they aren't entirely incompetent, which means that they have some plausibility of getting there first. And so if you believe that these things are true in some world in the future, then you should be freaking out about AI governance plausibly being not a guaranteed thing. And it also means that focusing on what these actors want and what they will do is a useful way of thinking about what you can do to address this problem in the first place. So that's kind of the first reason why focusing on actors is a good idea. The second reason is that we often talk about solutions. So when you read the newspapers, when you go to conferences, you'll have a bunch of people talking about AI governance solutions that look something like multilateral agreements, norms, standards, people collaborating on projects and cooperating, etc. And the really obvious thing to point out here is that these solutions are all products of actors today or actors in the near future deciding to do something together. And they have their incentives, they have choices they can make, and they have resources that they can invest. And so by looking upstream of these solutions and trying to understand what these actors are going to be wanting to do in the first place, that means you can then look downstream and understand what solutions are likely to exist later. So another way of saying focusing on actors is a good idea. Third and final time I say focusing on actors is a good idea. The third reason why is because a lot of the time we're really uncertain about a lot of things. This is me and my colleagues sitting in our office every day, and we freak out a lot because there's a lot of uncertainty in this space, and there's a lot of different variances in a lot of the variables that we look at. And there's really very hard to pin down things that will be concrete for a long amount of time, enough for us to do analysis really well. And one thing that is a little bit less uncertain than a bunch of other things is the nature of these actors. And the reason why is because you can see what they're doing today, for one. So you can look at a track record of what Alphabet is doing, has been doing. You can look at the US government and how they've approached strategic technology pursuit in the past. So you can sort of get some data points about these actors. That's one thing. And the second thing is that we've invested a bunch of effort into trying to model these actors before in other environments. So we've pursued technologies like nuclear, we've pursued technologies like biotechnology, and there are a lot of reasons to believe those are somewhat different to AI, but in any case, we've seen how those pan out. And so you can kind of look at what actors have done before and say, you know, maybe I can sort of guess at what you're about to do with this particular case of technology pursuit. So we're a little bit less uncertain. We're not entirely certain, but we're a little bit less uncertain about actors compared to a lot of other strategic parameters in this environment. So I've just basically told you 3 times that focusing on actors is kind of a good idea when you're looking at research in this space. So hopefully you're somewhat convinced. I can see somewhat convinced faces. So we're going to move on. And what I'm going to move on to is describing an approach to figuring out how you can think about actors that are pursuing this technology today. So what we'll do is we'll run through these 4 actors, and I'll give you some of a sense, some of a taste test of what they're talking about, what they're doing in this space currently. So first, you've got the US government. And the US government have done a bunch to indicate that they're really interested in artificial intelligence for a number of different reasons. And among a number of different things that they've done, in 2016, the Obama administration formulated an I can't for the life of me actually remember what NSTC stands for, but it's some kind of committee in the government that does a bunch of stuff with AI and ML. And that was an indication of many indications that the Obama administration put out to say that AI is a matter of national interest. Among a number of other things that have happened since then, you've had the Trump administration sign an AI executive order in February 2019. And it kind of says not a lot, but it does say that AI is kind of important. And that's one of the very first signals that the Trump administration has put out to say this administration also thinks that it's very important. If you look a little bit to the side and look at the Department of Defense in the US government, they've been a lot stronger about their expressed interest in AI. Among a number of things, they've issued a number of studies in the past, 2016 onwards, that have basically said that the DoD recognize that artificial intelligence are going to transform the way that the DoD conducts warfare. And so for them, it's a really important thing to invest in so they can remain at the forefront of what is considered a military competition in the international stage. Other things that they've done is that they've also established various things like cross-functional teams, and more recently the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center set up by the Pentagon. And all of that is to streamline investment and resource into a bunch of AI projects that the DoD are funding and that they're pursuing in order to have AI technologies developed so they can use them in things like active combat theater and various forms of military practice. So that's the US government. The summary there is something like Obama kind of started signaling it was important. The Trump administration and the DoD combined have more or less steered it in the direction of it's particularly important, particularly so we can compete on the military stage and so that we can also compete against China, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The Chinese government. This is the counterpart to this kind of international competition landscape. You've got the Chinese government who similarly come out in a slightly different fashion, saying that this is a matter of really strong national interest to us. Among a number of different data points they've given us about how important it is, a number of reports have come out since 2017, including a thing called the State Council New Generation AI Development Plan, that has said something like China intends to become the world's leader in AI as of 2030. And similarly, looking to the side and looking at the military, the People's Liberation Army in China, they've similarly indicated that they're very interested in it as a matter of strategic interest. So the PLA have this goal, this long-term goal of moving towards what they call intelligentization of warfare, which basically means using a bunch of big data and using a bunch of automated systems and using a bunch of AI and ML to gain an advantage on the military stage in a similar way to the way the DoD is intending to use it as well. So, summary of China is that the Chinese government similarly and the Chinese army similarly have indicated that they're very interested and very invested in pursuing this as a matter of national interest, as a matter of strategic interest, and as a matter of winning a competition on the international stage. The third actor I'll run through are these actors that we broadly call these multinational technology firms. And these are the ones who are very much at the forefront of actually developing and deploying these technologies today. The little logos that I put up there are a snapshot or a selection of the ones who are at the forefront of leading, particularly in leading advanced AI system development today. So you've got Google, Alphabet, OpenAI, and the 3 companies from China are Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. And there are a number of other labs and other companies that I haven't put up here who are similarly leading as well. And the reason why I've put them up here is twofold, really. One is to point out that they are private as opposed to government. So a number of these companies are based in the US, are based in China, but for the most part, they operate as global companies, and they operate with a different incentive structure to what the governments do. So I think that's important to note. And the second reason I put them up here as well is sort of counterintuitively to point out that they are also quite national. So you've got US companies and you've got Chinese companies, and there is a pretty strong bifurcation between US companies versus Chinese companies when we're talking about private actors leading here as well. And I'll tell you why that's relevant in a bit of a second. So that's a bit of a run through of the actors that are actively pursuing AI development and deployment today, and a bit of a taste of the things that they've said and the things that they've done, and sort of the things that they intend to do to pursue this technology for their own advantage. So what I'll do now is I'm going to plot these actors into some kind of model, and this is going to get a little bit academic for like 2 minutes, and then I'm going to come back down and actually illustrate why this is a useful thing. So bear with me for 2 minutes. This is a model of how these actors could be thought of as interacting with each other in some kind of abstract sense. So first you can start off with each of these actors alone. So that's a firm, that's a government, that's an army, etc. And each one of these actors, you can break them down into 3 components. A, their incentives, B, their resources, and C, their constraints. So incentives here are basically what are they incentivized to do? What are they motivated to do? What are they rewarded for doing? And also what are they punished for not doing? Resources are the things that this actor has that many other actors don't have. So what's their kind of comparative advantage relative to other actors who are also wanting to pursue AI? And then the constraints are the things that will stop this actor from doing what they want completely. So what do they have to respond to as a matter of law or as a matter of incentives, which constrains the nature of their actions. So each of these actors, you can think about them in terms of these 3 components. Oh, spoiler alert. Okay, bilateral relationships. This is where you kind of bring 2 actors together. So this is a super simplified way of trying to start rolling this into some kind of system. So for each one of these pairs of actors, so say you've got a firm and a government, or government to government, or whatever you have, you can broadly see them interacting in two ways. One is a synergy and one is a conflict. A synergy happens when you have 2 actors who have the same goal or not mutually exclusive goals, and their resources will complement each other and their constraints will complement each other as well. So basically they both want the same thing and they don't get in each other's way at the very worst. At the very best, they kind of support each other in pursuing the same goal. A conflict happens when you have different goals, but more than having different goals, you have to be able to stop each other from getting the goal that you want. So you have different goals and then you've got 2 actors and one of them at least has resources or constraints that will impose constraints on the other actor doing what they want in the first place. And that's how it becomes a conflict. A little footnote that's important here is that a synergy isn't always a good thing and a conflict isn't always a bad thing. So an example, a couple of concrete examples here. So a good synergy happens when, say for example, you have 2 firms who are mutually incentivized to invest in an AI safety project. A bad synergy is when you have a government paying a firm to deploy AI technologies in a way that is bad for society. So that's an example of a bad synergy. A bad conflict would be something like a race dynamic occurring between 2 actors, which incentivizes both of them to cut corners on safety. An example of a good conflict is, I'm sure there is one, an example of a good conflict could be something like friction introduced into the system, which means that you slow down development, generally speaking. Maybe good conflicts don't actually exist all that much. And then the last little bit of this whole system, and then I'll actually give you an example to make this make sense. The last little bit of the system is that you can then look at this whole landscape of actors and figure out how they interact with each other, and that will hopefully give you some sense of how this environment is going to play out when it comes to developing AI technology in the near future at least. Okay, so what we're going to do is use that model to understand a case study. And I'll give you a bit of a sense of what this case is, and then I'll tell you why this is a particularly interesting case for long-term AGI governance questions. So the case here, who here has heard of the Project Maven shenanigan? Okay. So this this case study basically started in March 2018 when there was this big article that came out, which basically blew the whistle on Google having signed a contract with the US government. And the US government contract was for a thing called Project Maven. Project Maven was probably the first big investment on the US government's part to use AI technology, specifically using drones and visual recognition technologies, to better target targets. And so they wanted an AI firm to help them develop a set of technologies to enable them to do more precise targeting. And Google had signed this contract to develop this technology and basically sell it to the US government. And this article blew the whistle on Google, signed this contract, and a bunch of stuff happened after that, a bunch of drama, which we'll walk through in a bit of a second. But to give you a sense of why this is an interesting question in the first place, it's interesting for a number of different reasons. One is that one of the most significant near to medium term risks of AI not being used in a way that we agree with as society is by AI being militarized in significant ways. And so I've already indicated that the PLA and the DoD are very interested in militarizing AI. And this was probably the first example of that actually coming into practice, at least with the US. So that's one reason, is it's a kind of seed of an example of what militarization of AI could look like. The second reason this is important is because it's an example of what happens when a large technology firm is asked to, / solicited to, cooperate with the US government. And in general, this question of who is going to be able to control how this technology is used, whether it's the government or the firm or other actors, and who's going to win in debating who's going to control it. That, in general, is a very important question for the reason that we started right back at the start with, is that we care a lot about who ends up being able to control this technology and who ends up calling the shots on what's being done with it. So this is an example where you've got two very powerful actors kind of butting heads and trying to figure out what the right outcome should be. Seems like an important one. So what we'll do is we'll use our little model and try to figure out what these different actors want in this process. So the first actor you've got is the US Department of Defense. So you've got incentives, resources, constraints. Their incentives are to pursue advanced military capabilities using AI. The resources that they have is they can fund a bunch of people and pay a bunch of people to do it. Their constraints are that the US government for a very long time hasn't been able to develop cutting edge technologies in-house, which means that they're somewhat reliant on being able to contract other people, specifically other commercial technology firms, to develop that technology for them. And it used to be the case that the US government could do R&D internally, but for a number of different not so interesting historical reasons, it's kind of gone down the drain a little bit. And so now it's very much commercial firms that do a lot of the technology development in the US. So that's the US Department of Defense. And then you've got Google management, incentives, resources, constraints. So their incentives are to make a ton of money. Their resources are something like frontier technology. So as I said before, a lot of these firms are kind of at the leading edge of developing this technology in the first place. And so Alphabet being one of them, they've got a lot of that cutting edge tech in-house. Their constraints, there are a number of constraints on what Google can do. For one, they can't do something that's illegal. But their constraints that ended up being the most important in this case is the constraint of public image. So Google has this line of don't do evil or don't do enough evil to like get attention and be told off for it. And in this case, the public image side of that kicked in as one of the main constraints of their actions that they could take. And we'll see why in a second. And the last actor that you have here are Google engineers. And I've modeled them somewhat separately to Google management, even if they're employed, because in this case, it was actually pretty important to understand that they have different incentives, different resources, and different constraints to their employee company. Their incentives are something like rewarding employment, so being able to do something that they agree with in the act of carrying out their work. Resources are themselves, so AI talent is a very large bottleneck in this space, and particularly when it comes to engineers. A company will do sort of a disproportionate amount today, at least, when you've got this bottleneck in place, to retain engineers in the first place. The constraints that kicked in are that Google engineers can't actually make decisions on behalf of the company, obviously. So they can do a bunch of activity and a bunch of campaigning and lobbying, but at the end of the day, given the structure of the company, you've got to have a Google management person or a Google management sort of system make the decision at the end of the day. I know, okay. 5 minutes, people. 5 minutes. We're going to get through it. Okay. So this is going to result in two relationships that matter a lot in this case. So the first is a synergy and the second is a conflict. This is oversimplified, by the way, but these are the two most important ones that came out. The synergy at the first place is between Google management and DoD. And this one's a pretty simple one to understand, in that the DoD wanted to pay a firm to do a really important cutting-edge AI tech thing, and Google wants to be paid to do cutting AI-edge tech things. So they had a transactional relationship there. The kind of additional interesting footnote here is that this contract was in many ways strategized internally to Google as a way to get them much larger Pentagon contracts down the line. So there was a bunch of released kind of notes and released meeting notes between Google management, which basically had Project Maven slated as the way that Google would be able to get some kind of acquisition certification in the US, which would enable them to then access a bunch of Pentagon contracts that were worth a lot more later down the track because they had engaged in Project Maven. So in many ways, the synergy is a much bigger synergy than this particular project. It was a synergy of like a long-term relationship between Google and DoD that the Google management really wanted to pursue. The conflict on the other side was between Google management and Google engineers. And the thing that happened here was that as soon as this was sort of found out, Google engineers kicked up a fuss, and like a really big fuss. So they started campaigning, they wrote a letter and had a bunch of people sign it. A bunch of people here sounds sort of menial, but it was like thousands and thousands of their employees, including Jeff Dean, who's the head of Google AI. And basically the letter said something like, we think it's entirely unacceptable for Google to say yes to this project and to sign this contract, and we as your employees have a big issue with it. So much so that a number of employees quit, and a number of employees continued to kick up a fuss and showed up to town halls and continued on with this for a month or so. So synergy, conflict. The outcome of this, before I give you the outcome, think about this for a second in terms of the bigger picture. So the reason why this is an important case is because you've seen a bunch of powerful actors, a large firm, a large government, and a very powerful research community all have different reasons to want this to land differently. So they've all wanted to pursue AI development in different ways. And on this particular instance of militarizing AI for the US government, those things have come to a head. Those have come into conflict. And the outcome of this will tell you something, maybe, about the way that these kind of future relationships will likely pan out. So the end of this lands in June 1st, 2018, when Google announced that it would pull out of the contract. And it also announced a bunch of AI principles. And the AI principles are interesting because it basically says we won't do the evil thing anymore. But one of the clauses in there basically says that Google can still engage in Pentagon contracts. So in some ways, they snuck in and out for themselves in issuing these principles in the first place. But in any case, this was how the case landed. So in many ways, you can kind of think about this as a couple of things. One is that Google engineers won, perhaps. Two is that Google management maybe won because they gained their engineers back and they sort of assuaged their concerns, but they still enabled themselves to engage in Pentagon contracts at some point down the track. And then three, at the meta level, this is one way of understanding that these conflicts don't have obvious endings. So I think a lot of people didn't think that Google engineers would win, and a lot of people thought that the US government would win. And so in this case, I think it's an interesting case to study because it gives the research community a lot more power than a lot of people assumed they would have. Okay, I'm going to stop before my voice dies. But one thing I'll leave you with is that this is an example of the kind of research that you can do to try to understand how these things are likely to pan out in the future. Thanks, team.